Napoleon didn't just conquer Europe. He turned it into a revenue stream. Entire kingdoms marched under his shadow. Armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands crossed borders with mechanical precision. Monarchies fell, treaties were signed, maps were redrawn. But behind the battlefield, drama was something colder, more calculated. Napoleon built a war machine that forced Europe to finance its own subjugation. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks. At the height of his power, Napoleon controlled or dominated territory stretching from Spain to Poland, from the North Sea to southern Italy. His Grande Armée at one point mobilized more than 600,000 troops. The scale of operations was unprecedented. Supplying, feeding, arming, and paying such a force required staggering resources. Yet here's the paradox. France in 1799, when Napoleon seized power, was not rich. It was financially traumatized. To understand how Napoleon funded his empire, you have to start with collapse. By the late 1780s, the French monarchy was drowning in debt. The 7 Years' War had been costly. France's support for the American Revolution added roughly 1.3 billion livres to the crown's liabilities. By 1788, interest payments consumed over half of royal revenues. The monarchy wasn't overthrown because of ideology alone. It was overthrown because it couldn't pay its bills. Then came the Revolution and a financial experiment that nearly destroyed the country. In 1790, revolutionary leaders issued assignats, paper currency backed by confiscated church lands. At first it seemed clever. Monetize seized property, inject liquidity, stabilize the economy. Instead, the government printed aggressively. By 1795, over 45 billion livres in assignats had been issued. Inflation spiraled. The currency collapsed. Prices soared. Savings evaporated. Trust disintegrated. France experienced something approaching hyperinflation. If there were a gold medal for financial improvisation under pressure, revolutionary France would have claimed it briefly before the currency disintegrated. This was the country Napoleon inherited in 1799 after the coup of 18 Brumaire, a nation exhausted by internal terror, economic instability, and war against multiple European coalitions. Napoleon understood something essential. You cannot wage permanent war on monetary chaos. His first move was not another invasion. It was stabilization. In 1800, he established the Bank of France. It was not fully independent in the modern sense, but it restored structure. In 1803, he introduced the franc germinal, a metallic currency anchored to gold and silver, stable, predictable, credible. Tax collection was centralized. Administrative systems were modernized. Corruption was reduced. Government accounts were brought under tighter control. Inside France, Napoleon ran a surprisingly disciplined fiscal operation. Budgets were often balanced during the early years of his rule. Domestic taxation was strengthened. Revenue became predictable. But here's the pivot. Napoleon refused to let French citizens bear the full cost of permanent war. So he exported the bill. After each major victory, France imposed indemnities on defeated states. These weren't symbolic gestures. They were massive financial transfers. In 1805, after defeating Austria at Austerlitz, the Treaty of Pressburg forced Austria to pay 40 million francs in indemnities. That figure represented a crushing burden relative to Austria's annual revenues. In 1807, after humiliating Prussia, the Treaty of Tilsit imposed contributions estimated at around 120 million francs. To grasp the scale, French annual military expenditures in the early 1800s fluctuated around 600–700 million francs. A single indemnity could finance months of war. Napoleon's model was brutally efficient: conquer territory, impose indemnity, station French troops at the expense of the occupied state, extract cash, grain, supplies, horses, and use those resources to fund the next campaign. War financed war. At times, foreign contributions covered a substantial portion of France's military costs. German states in the Confederation of the Rhine were obligated to supply troops and funds. Italy financed French garrisons. Holland bore heavy financial burdens. Spain, before it rebelled, was drawn into the system. This was not loose looting, it was structured extraction. Napoleon transformed conquest into cash flow. But the system had a mathematical constraint. It required expansion. As long as France kept winning decisively, new revenue streams opened. Each victory funded the next mobilization. The empire functioned like a leveraged expansion strategy. Growth covered liabilities. But once expansion slowed, the liabilities remained. To make matters more complex, Napoleon didn't rely solely on indemnities. He also deployed forced loans, compelling cities and states to extend credit to the French administration. These were not optional investments, they were obligations imposed under occupation. Meanwhile, conscription fed manpower into the army, but financing fed everything else. Feeding hundreds of thousands of troops required logistics on a scale Europe had never seen. The Grande Armée consumed enormous quantities of grain, livestock, uniforms, ammunition, and artillery. This wasn't medieval raiding. It was industrial-scale mobilization before the Industrial Revolution fully matured. And then came Napoleon's most ambitious economic weapon, the Continental System. In 1806, after failing to defeat Britain at sea, Napoleon attempted to destroy it economically. Through the Berlin Decree, he prohibited European nations under French influence from trading with Britain. The aim was to strangle British exports, cripple its economy, and force capitulation. On paper, it was bold. Britain depended heavily on trade. In practice, it was a continental gamble. European economies were deeply intertwined with British commerce. Textiles, manufactured goods, colonial imports, many flowed through British channels. By severing those links, Napoleon damaged not just Britain's trade, but Europe's own economic circulation. Smuggling exploded. Coastal regions evaded enforcement. Black markets thrived. Merchants suffered. Industrial sectors contracted in some territories. Russia, increasingly frustrated by the economic strain, began violating the Continental System. That defiance set the stage for one of the most catastrophic financial decisions in European history. In 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia. The campaign mobilized approximately 600,000 troops from across the empire and its satellite states. It was the largest army Europe had ever seen, and it was financially devastating. Supply lines stretched thousands of kilometers. Provisioning such a force required staggering resources. As the campaign faltered and winter descended, losses mounted catastrophically. By the time the remnants retreated, perhaps fewer than 100,000 men returned in effective fighting condition. The human loss was catastrophic. The financial loss was strategic. Napoleon's model depended on victorious campaigns that generated revenue. The Russian disaster generated nothing but cost. No indemnity, no tribute, no new revenue stream. Instead, it drained manpower, supplies, and morale. After the disaster in Russia in 1812, France could no longer convert battlefield momentum into cash flow. The Grande Armée had been shattered. Satellite states hesitated. Resistance movements intensified. Britain, financed by deep capital markets and public debt, subsidized continental allies. By 1813, a new coalition pushed back decisively. By 1813, coalition forces pushed into Central Europe. Battles like Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, mobilized hundreds of thousands of troops on both sides. Mobilization itself required financing on a scale that strained every treasury involved. And here's the critical shift. Once Napoleon's armies retreated, the flow of indemnities stopped. France now faced war expenses without external financing. The burden began returning home. Napoleon's domestic fiscal discipline only worked because external resources absorbed much of the cost. Once indemnities faded, France faced the same structural problem that had destabilized the monarchy in 1788. War was expensive and revenue was finite. Britain's model differed fundamentally from Napoleon's. Instead of relying on indemnities, Britain leaned heavily on public debt markets. Through long-term bonds, consols, it financed war across decades. Investors purchased government debt because they trusted repayment. The Bank of England and Parliament provided continuity. British debt soared to levels exceeding 200% of GDP by 1815, but it remained serviceable because Britain's financial system was institutionalized, not expansion-dependent. Napoleon's system was dynamic but fragile. Britain's was slower but scalable. This distinction reshaped Europe after 1815. When Napoleon abdicated and was exiled in 1814, briefly returning in 1815 before Waterloo ended it permanently, Europe faced reconstruction. The Congress of Vienna redrew political boundaries, but financial damage couldn't be erased by diplomatic ink. Years of warfare had destabilized economies, disrupted trade, and loaded states with obligations. Indemnities reversed direction. France, now defeated, was required to pay 700 million francs in war reparations. After 1815, Allied occupation forces were stationed in French territory until payments were secured. The empire that once extracted indemnities now paid them. The model inverted. France stabilized surprisingly quickly under the restored monarchy. But the psychological lesson lingered. Military dominance without financial sustainability was brittle. This is where the story extends beyond France. The Napoleonic Wars accelerated a transformation in European finance. Britain's ability to sustain prolonged warfare through credit markets demonstrated that institutional trust could outlast battlefield volatility. Sovereign debt became a strategic asset rather than merely a liability. Capital markets emerged from the wars not weakened but entrenched. Investors who financed British war bonds were effectively investing in geopolitical outcomes. Finance and power fused tightly. London's status as a global financial hub strengthened through wartime necessity. Meanwhile, continental Europe absorbed the scars. Prussia restructured its taxation and administration aggressively after defeat. Austria modernized aspects of its fiscal system. The shock forced reform. War, when financed poorly, collapses states. When financed structurally, it reshapes them. Now step back. Napoleon didn't just fight battles, he tested a model. Externalize the cost of dominance, shift the burden outward, let conquered territories finance expansion. It worked until it didn't. That pattern feels distant only if you ignore modern geopolitics. Great powers today still attempt to shift costs beyond their borders. Economic sanctions redirect pressure outward. Trade policies move burdens across supply chains. Currency dominance allows nations to export inflation or attract global capital to finance deficits. The ability to externalize cost is power, but it is also conditional. Napoleon's empire functioned like a leveraged growth strategy. Growth covered obligations, victory justified extraction. Expansion maintained liquidity. When growth reversed, leverage crushed the structure. Modern financial systems operate on similar dynamics, though far more complex. Governments issue debt assuming future growth will service it. Central banks provide liquidity to prevent contraction from cascading. Capital flows stabilize imbalances until they don't. Nothing says permanent stability like requiring continuous growth to justify continuous leverage. That's not cynicism, it's arithmetic. The Napoleonic era shows us that scale alone does not guarantee sustainability. An army of 600,000 men did not protect the empire once the financial engine stalled. Military capacity without scalable funding becomes unsustainable. And here's the more subtle lesson. Napoleon was not financially reckless in the traditional sense. He stabilized currency. He modernized administration. He improved tax collection. Domestically, he corrected many of the financial mistakes of the revolution. But his strategic model assumed that political dominance would indefinitely produce economic extraction. It was a growth model without a plateau strategy. Once Europe coordinated against him financially and militarily, the model collapsed. The coalition powers didn't just defeat France with armies, they financed resistance through Britain's capital markets. British subsidies funded continental forces. Debt became ammunition. Money and power were inseparable. Now bring this forward carefully. In today's global financial system, the United States occupies a position somewhat analogous to Britain in 1815. It anchors the dominant reserve currency. It sustains large public debt through deep capital markets. Treasury securities serve as global collateral. Investors treat them as safe assets. That position confers extraordinary flexibility. It allows the U.S. to finance deficits at scale. It allows countercyclical spending during crisis. It allows liquidity provision during global shocks. But that flexibility rests on credibility. Britain maintained trust because Parliament constrained fiscal behavior and because debt service remained reliable. If trust had broken, interest rates would have surged and the system would have buckled. The same structural rule applies universally. Externalizing cost works while credibility holds. Once credibility fractures, costs return home. Napoleon learned that when expansion halted and indemnities evaporated, France then bore the full weight of war financing. Modern economies don't rely on tribute, but they do rely on growth assumptions, global demand for debt instruments, and confidence in institutional continuity. The psychology isn't medieval, it's timeless. Every dominant power faces the temptation to believe its financial model is exceptional. Spain believed silver was inexhaustible. Napoleon believed victory would perpetuate revenue. Every system at its peak appears structurally superior until a shock exposes its constraint. The Napoleonic Wars didn't bankrupt Europe overnight. They redistributed burdens. They reshaped financial hierarchies. They demonstrated that institutional credit markets outlast conquest-based financing. The most powerful army in Europe fell. The strongest bond market endured. That's the economic battle behind the battlefield narrative. For viewers interested in financial education and real wealth, this matters deeply. Economic bubbles, sovereign debt crises, inflation cycles, they all revolve around sustainability versus expansion, leverage versus discipline, extraction versus productivity. Financial freedom at the individual level follows the same rule. Growth strategies that depend on constant external inflow, rising asset prices, speculative gains, borrowed leverage, can look unstoppable, but when inflow slows, fragility appears. Systems built on disciplined cash flow and structural resilience outlast cycles. Napoleon's empire was spectacular. It was fast. It was innovative. But it required motion. Once motion stopped, the bill arrived. History doesn't punish ambition. It punishes unsustainable financing. The Napoleonic era wasn't just about cannons and cavalry. It was about balance sheets and bond markets. It was about who paid, who extracted, and who endured. The real empire wasn't the one that conquered the most land. It was the one that mastered credit. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers.